A good rule of thumb when it comes to fantasy or sci-fi TV shows is that there will always be at least one weird episode. Star Wars The Clone Wars had quite a few. See R2 and C-3PO negotiating with a race of trees that lives underground, Mace Windu and Jar Jar Binks teaming up to fight a cult, and Padme and Satine literally investigating tea imports on Mandalore. But among these weird episodes, there's a really good one that stands out, Brain Invaders, the 8th episode of Season 2. In this video, we'll be taking a look at why such an odd and risky episode ended up being so good.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
We've mentioned in the past that Star Wars The Clone Wars was great because its writers were given a whole lot of freedom when it came to taking risks. Brain Invaders was a perfect example of that. Setting an episode of a show about the Clone Wars aboard a medical vessel and then adding the classic horror brainworm trope to the mix is probably not something we'll ever see under the likes of Disney for one simple reason. It's a big risk. It blurs the genre lines between space opera and horror, and mixing such distinct genres like that isn't usually considered a smart move. And yet, it ended up working pretty well. Now, before we get into this, we want to clarify that, unlike in previous Clone Wars episode analysis, we're not claiming that Brain Invaders shaped the show in some way. Sure, it had character development that manifested in later episodes, which we'll get into later, but it didn't really change the show per se. There were no notable writing shifts, no interesting new recurring elements introduced, nothing of the sort. There are a bunch of small things that come together in this episode that make it a worthwhile watch. So without further ado, let's get into them. In terms of plot, Brain Invaders picked up where Legacy of Terror, the previous episode, left off. Legacy of Terror had introduced Karina the Great's Geonosian brainworms as a plot device to bring zombie Geonosians into the picture, and the episode revolved around Karina's plan to use these worms to control the Jedi for her own ends. Karina, of course, was defeated, and Poggle the Lesser was captured, bringing the arc of the second Battle of Geonosis to an end. But Brain Invaders would continue the story of the brainworms and Karina's plot, as we all know, albeit in a different way. One of the reasons Brain Invaders is such an effective episode is that the characters that the Geonosian worms control are all in some way familiar and sympathetic. Barriss Offee and a platoon of clones. Having been featured prominently in the Weapons Factory, an earlier episode, Barriss was already well known to the audience, and while the clones of Tango Company were new characters, their nature as clones made them somewhat sympathetic by default. This is what makes the horror aspect of Brain Invaders work. There aren't really identifiable antagonists, just a group of characters with whom the audience is familiar as heroes. After all, horror plots with identifiable antagonists work because they place the protagonists at serious disadvantages, forcing their objective to revolve around hiding or escape, not victory. Were Ahsoka faced with a platoon of Geonosian zombies in the episode, or the brainworms controlled less sympathetic characters, the horror element would be gone. She'd be perfectly capable of just cutting her way through them. But because the worms are possessing clones, and eventually a close friend of hers, she's mostly unwilling to truly fight. She kills the possessed clones when forced to, but she tries to avoid it. And so the plot falls into a proper horror dynamic of the antagonist hunting the outmatched protagonist. Which brings us to another reason why the episode was so great: character development. By this point in the show, Ahsoka has already grown a lot as a character since Christosis, and in Brain Invaders, she grows some more. The nature of the episode's plot forces her to learn some of the stealth skills, and it puts her resourcefulness to the test, especially since, in the later parts of the episode, she's alone. Chronologically, this is her first real solo mission. Once Barriss is taken, for the first time that we know of, she's up against challenging enemies with absolutely nobody by her side. That she comes out on top is a sign that she's getting strong. Also, for the first time, this episode pits her against her own allies, including a new friend of hers. The possessed clones and Barriss are a more complicated enemy than what Ahsoka is used to, and she's forced to outthink them instead of just attacking. Barriss makes things even more complicated. Ahsoka really doesn't want to fight her, but she ultimately has no choice. The way she handles her battle with Barriss is another sign of her developing maturity. She manages to stay calm and defeat the worm controlling Barriss without killing her friend. The horror of this episode is another reason why it works. Even though horror can often clash sharply with the style that the Clone Wars typically has. It works primarily because the writers were able to establish the standard horror dynamic, because brainworms are used commonly enough in sci-fi for it not to be that jarring, and most of all because of Legacy of Terror. The previous episode established that there was a reason why the Geonosians had brainworms, and it makes the nature of the threat in Brain Invaders clear. More importantly, it provides some logic for that threat. Without Legacy of Terror to introduce the worms, Brain Invaders would have been really jarring, but because it introduced the worms in a way that works with the Star Wars universe, the episode fits a lot better. We know the true antagonist, and it's not a break in character or anything for them to be operating in the way that they are. With the nature of the threat already established and the other elements in place, the horror story of Brain Invaders works rather smoothly with the rest of the show. Brain Invaders nailed other elements that are crucial to good horror as well. It maintained a level of uncertainty up until the end. It presented the story through relatable characters that end up in situations that make the audience feel trapped, and it presented something that, within the universe, it makes sense to be genuinely terrified of. Having a worm go up your nose and take over your body is an extremely uncomfortable concept, which is why it's a commonly used trope and why the writers did a good job of making this uncomfortableness stick. Of course, there's also another, much more obvious reason that Brain Invaders is a good episode, and we're gonna play it for you. This quick 1-minute scene is perfect. For starters, it was the first scene in the entire show where Darth Vader became visible through the cracks in Anakin Skywalker's personality. Anakin had shown his angry side before, but this was a huge step further than the show had ever gone with his character before. It's really well done too. The tone is set right away by the music and Anakin's general tone and body language, but most viewers would think that it was just going to be more of the angrier version of Anakin that we'd seen before. Darker, but not Vader by any stretch. Of course, that expectation is shattered when Anakin outright punches Poggle, hitting him with such force that he's knocked out to the corner. This, as well as Anakin's general stance and the angle of the shot that follows, generally does exactly what it's supposed to do, make the viewer slightly uncomfortable, especially when Poggle keeps resisting. The force choke at the end is the icing on the cake. It makes it perfectly clear that this is a Vader moment that we're seeing, and intensifies the uncomfortability of the previous shots as well, lingering on Anakin's face and Poggle's dancing feet for just long enough for the meaning of the scene to sink in. Furthermore, there was no real lead up to get the audience to expect it. No foreshadowing, and the implication that comes as a result of this is what makes this scene in particular so powerful. There being no build up to this scene leads the viewer to believe that there was no need for a build up, which leads to the conclusion that this isn't unusual. And indeed it wasn't. Anakin had already slaughtered a whole village on Tatooine, as we saw in Attack of the Clones. Those who are more aware of the expanded universe knew that Anakin had given into his anger again in the months before the show as well, unleashing his fury on Asajj Ventress both on Yavin 4 and Coruscant, and learning how to choke people with the Force at the end of the Battle of Jabim. This scene isn't made out to be some big step toward the darkness or an important part of Anakin's descent. The implication of this scene is that the step that Anakin needed to take toward the dark side to get to this point was one that he had already taken. More importantly, this means that this side of Anakin, the Vader-esque force-choking nightmare interrogator, had existed for at least most of the show beneath the surface, concurrently with the relatable, heroic Jedi Knight that, by this point, audiences had come to love. So that's your lesson in writing a story for today. But in all seriousness guys, what do you think? Are there any other Clone Wars episodes that you'd like to see us go into like this? Feel free to post your thoughts in the comment section below. And just before you go guys, please make sure you check out all those links in the description below. And with our Geetsly's Gaming Network, our Roblox is back up and running, so we're looking for some talented developers to come help out on the project. So make sure you message me on Discord and we can set something up. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching and I hope to see you in the next video.